The following story was written by Priestess of Spiders and was posted to r/no sleep. If you like the story and you would like to check out some of Priestess's other works, I left a link down in the description below to her page. As always, guys, if you enjoy this content and you would like to see more, please make sure to subscribe, and thank you for stopping by. I'd like to note that what follows is not my own work. A good friend of mine, who, for the purposes of her privacy, shall be referred to as Trinity, sent 4 text documents to me with instructions that the, quote, 4 stages be distributed over a period of 4 days, and that I am not to open the documents prior to their appointed posting date. She did not explain the reason for this, simply stating that it was imperative that I obey her instructions to the letter, and I swore to her that I would. She thanked me, and I have received no message from her since. All of my subsequent attempts to reach Trinity for further information have been ignored. The mundane details of this first document do seem largely to conform to what I know about Trinity's personal life, and I can thus verify their accuracy. Beyond that, I'm afraid I cannot provide an explanation for the more unusual portions of her story. Signed, Helen Theodora Waite. It's their fault. None of this would have happened if it wasn't for them. I would have been fine. I could have lived out my whole life in peace without ever looking at it. But it's too late to think about that now. There is no undoing what has been done. Don't ever get married at 21. I don't care if you've known them for years. I don't care if you feel like you want to grow old with them. Never, under any circumstances, give in to that impulse, especially if it's your first real relationship. You're not old enough to understand what is good for you, and you won't understand if you're being abused. My own ill-advised marriage lasted 3 years before it fell apart, though the warning signs were there long before they slipped a ring on my finger. Their name was Seth, and they possessed just the sort of low cunning necessary to twist a woman like me around their finger. Trans girls freshly out of the closet are an easy target for manipulation, were desperate for validation, possess extremely little in the way of self-esteem, and are very easy to trick into doing anything you want. Is your wife upset? Clearly she's behaving aggressively due to her male socialization. You should let her know that that sort of behavior makes you feel very afraid. Does your wife have difficulty performing all of the housework in addition to being employed full-time to support the both of you? Obviously an example of weaponized male incompetence. She should unlearn that toxic masculine behavior. This sort of thing works especially well if you happen to also be some flavor of gender outlaw. Needless to say, those 3 years were some of the darkest of my life, to the extent that I passively accepted the terms of divorce when Seth finally grew tired of me and tossed me aside in favor of a new model, proudly proclaiming that they managed to move on and heal from their past trauma, but that I simply hadn't been able to grow with them. They still took my money, of course. It's my fault, really. I should have never agreed to paying alimony. It's not like it was required, given the short length of the union, after all, but they were always very good at convincing me to do whatever they wanted, and they had explained to me that I owed them payment for the years they had spent dealing with the burden of being in a relationship with me. The alimony agreement was odd. At least that's what the diplomatic way that the clerk put it when I showed her the paperwork. They wanted to have a portion of my monthly income, 25% of it, for a year. The clerk even explained to me that I didn't have to agree to this sort of thing, that under the state law there was no obligation for me to accept it, but my mind was filled with 3 years' worth of fine-tuned brainwashing, and she wound up accepting the signed document with a sigh. It took a few months of talking with my friends about the divorce to even realize that I was the one who was being abused. It's not like I was trying to gain sympathy about it. For a very long time, I felt as though everything was my fault, that I had been a terrible wife. But the more I talked about my marriage, the more alarmed my friends and family members would become. I know this sounds like I'm just complaining about a bad marriage, but it's necessary in order to understand the context of what has happened to me. It was exactly a year and a day after the divorce was finalized when my grandmother died. I was incredibly surprised to find that in her will she had listed me as the inheritor of her old house. It made sense, I suppose. My father and aunt both had their own houses at this point, and my aunt had no children, and I was an only child. I just wasn't expecting to become a homeowner at 25. In addition to the house, she also left me a not insubstantial sum of money, enough at least to rest comfortably for a few months while I settled into my new home. I wound up quitting my job, a dead end retail position that had long since overstayed its welcome, and moved into the house nearly immediately, getting to work on cleaning it up. If I'm being entirely honest, I wasn't too fond of the house. It's not that I had many bad memories there or anything like that, beyond my grandmother's descent into some nutty conspiracy theories in her old age. We always managed to get along pretty well. But it was a house that was too large for just one person. It wasn't a mansion, not by any means, but it had 3 bedrooms, the sort of place you were meant to raise a family in. I converted one of them into an office, used another for storage, and slept in the third, but even then, there always felt like there was far too much space. When you live alone in a house that is too big for you, you never really feel like you're actually the only one there, especially at night. At some point, Seth caught wind of my inheritance. I guess they must have heard about it through the grapevine or stalked one of my social media pages. I don't really know or care how they found out. All that matters is that they had discovered I'd inherited a large sum of money the exact day after I was no longer required to pay them a portion of my income. I got the call in the afternoon as I was looking through some of the job boards, checking to see if there were any openings near me that seemed even slightly more tolerable than unskilled labor or retail drudgery. I saw that it was Seth and hesitantly picked up the phone, thinking to myself that I should have blocked their number a long time ago. "So when exactly were you going to tell me?" came the voice from the other end of the phone. "About what?" "The inheritance. The fact that you own a house now. Real convenient that it happened the day right after your alimony ended, isn't it? You always were a terrible liar." The voice was filled with hatred and contempt, the kind of tone you used to talk about cockroaches and maggots. "Listen, Seth, I've paid you what you've asked me to already. It's not my fault that this happened the way it did. I'm sorry, but don't lie to me. I want my share. I know you were hiding this from me, and if you don't give it willingly, I'm going to talk to an attorney. Don't you under—" I hung up the phone. Nearly instantly, another call came through. I declined it. I then proceeded to decline 3 more calls and ignore nearly a dozen messages as my phone's buzzer continually went off during a minute or so that it took to block Seth's number. I felt a wave of adrenaline washing over me, my heart beating faster, my body convinced that it was in danger. I took some deep breaths. Closing the job board site, I shut my laptop and decided to go for a little walk around the block, leaving my phone behind. The walk helped me steady my nerves quite a bit, even though my surroundings were simply identical suburban homes and fenced in yards. Just being out in the sun and the warm spring air helped to remind me that I was in the here and now and not back in my marriage. After a few minutes of strolling, I got back home, only to find a fresh source of stress. Numerous notifications on my phone indicated that someone had been trying to sign into my email, my bank account, and my social media profiles. I realized then I hadn't changed most of my credentials following the divorce and remembered that Seth had insisted on knowing my passwords just in case anything happened. Fortunately, 2-factor authentication, ever a thorn in my side, seemed to actually do something useful for once, and the only sites that had been breached were a couple of social media profiles, which had been promptly deleted in an act of petty revenge. I sighed and began getting to work changing all of the passwords to my various accounts, as well as putting in requests to have my deleted profiles reinstated. It was while I was doing all of this, which required the use of my email, that I noticed something odd in my inbox. There was a new email lurking among the numerous password confirmation messages, simply titled "Look at Me." The email address wasn't one I recognized, a Gmail account with a random string of characters for its name. It didn't have any body text, just a single image attachment. My immediate assumption, of course, was that this was Seth. Part of me wanted to delete it right away. I wish I did. But instead, motivated by morbid curiosity and anger, I found myself clicking on the email to download the image, which was named lookatme.png. In the past, Seth had an upsetting tendency to hurt themselves in front of me whenever they got upset at me, purposefully banging their head against a wall or punching their chest until I intervened, whereupon they would begin to take out their violent impulses on me instead. Once they even cut themselves with a kitchen knife in front of me, the blood dripping down onto the stained gray carpet as they screamed at me that I had done this to them, that I was so impossibly stupid that they had to do this to make me understand that I was wrong. I don't even remember what the argument had been about. I just recall the smell of iron and the sight of fresh, red blood, the sound of insults ringing in my ears. I assumed that the image would be a picture of Seth hurting themselves in some way. If it was, I had some half-baked idea of contacting a lawyer and getting some sort of restraining order set up against them. I braced myself for the worst and opened lookatme.png. When the Photos program launched, however, it wasn't what I was expecting whatsoever. In fact, I couldn't even tell what exactly it was that I was looking at. It was a very dark image, so dark that I could barely make out anything at all, just vague shapes in a field of shadow. Pressing the Edit Photo button, I began to fiddle with the contrast, shadows, and brightness settings to try and get a look at what was there. As I messed around with the image settings, a shape began to emerge out of the mass of darkness. It was still too dark to make out exactly, but it was recognizable vaguely as a face of some sort, cocked at an extreme angle and facing the camera. The eyes were too shadowed to make out, and long dark hair covered most of the face, but I could tell vaguely that the mouth was stretched into something almost resembling a smile. There was something subtly familiar with the proportions of the face, but as I started to try and further lower the contrast to get a better look, the screen suddenly went completely black. I could hear my PC's fan turned on at full speed and smelled the scent of hot plastic that comes when you push a computer's processing power to the limit. Panicking, I pressed down hard on the power button until the fan stopped. Rebooting my computer, I sat there with bated breath, silently praying that whatever I'd downloaded hadn't completely wiped my PC or locked me behind ransomware. The login screen came up as usual, and I let out a sigh of relief that there wasn't any obvious sign of damage when the desktop loaded up normally. I checked the downloads folder to go and delete lookatme.png, but it wasn't there. Similarly, a peek into my email inbox revealed nothing unusual either. I was still convinced that it had been some sort of malware, so I performed a routine scan with my antivirus, but everything turned up normal. It was as if nothing had happened. For the rest of that day, everything did seem more or less ordinary. I made dinner, read a little bit, and then spent a few hours watching mindless videos on the internet before heading off to sleep, finally at a frankly irresponsible hour of the night. I was still upset, of course, over Seth's attempts to break into my accounts, my deleted social media profiles, and the strange image that, at the time, I assumed had been sent out in an attempt to unnerve me. Seth knew I was a very paranoid person, and it seemed in character for them to send me a disturbing image that would mysteriously vanish after crashing my PC. I wasn't quite sure that they could have pulled it off, as Seth was never particularly technically competent, but at the time I had no doubts that it had some sort of conventional explanation. The morning after my downloading of lookatme.png began with me checking my email to see if my deleted social media profiles had been restored. Unfortunately, there was no such luck. Grumpily tossing aside my phone, I got up to make myself some breakfast. I knew that I was running low on food as my scheduled grocery run was set for the next day, so I decided to make some steamed white rice with sausages as my breakfast. Not exactly a conventional meal to start off the day, but food is food, and I hadn't yet opened the fresh bag of rice I'd purchased last week. I opened up the pantry and reached for the bag, but stopped short just before I could grasp it. The canvas sack was squirming slightly, and I could hear faint rustling sounds coming from inside. There didn't seem to be any holes or tears in the canvas for something to have gotten in, but I felt slightly nauseous watching the faint writhing through the cloth. Cautiously, I opened the bag, bracing myself. I was greeted with a mass of dirty white fur and dozens of beady red eyes, worm like tails whipping around in confusion. Rats. As soon as the bag was opened, they poured out in a torrent, a tide of fur and scrabbling claws, squeaking as I shrieked in surprise and disgust. Several of them seemed to be badly wounded, having seemingly started fighting with one another after their confinement in the sack, leaving bloody and eerily human-like footprints on the wooden floor. I felt myself hyperventilating as I tried to desperately keep them away from me. I spent the next several hours catching every single rat that I could find, putting them in a large plastic storage tub that I had hastily emptied and made into a makeshift cage. I picked them up by their tails, skin crawling as the vermin tried to bite at me through my gardening gloves. Even after I couldn't find any more of them, I still spent a long time searching every nook and cranny in the house, desperate to make sure that all of them were gone. I didn't bother eating breakfast, or lunch for that matter. I'd woken up at around 10:30, and that unpleasant surprise in the pantry had utterly and completely ruined any appetite I may have otherwise had, especially after I found what remained in the canvas rice bag. There were a handful of infant rats, pinkies as they're commonly referred to. They all showed signs of having been cannibalized by their elders. A couple were still half alive, and I put them out of their misery as humanely as I could before taking the adults to animal control. I remember when I first learned to hate rats. You see, Seth kept a large number of snakes. By the time of the divorce, there must have been dozens of the things, ball pythons mainly. They had explained to me that the different colorations and patterns of pythons could be sold for huge sums of money, and ultimately planned on breeding them as primary source of income, something which never came to fruition for as long as we were together. In order to pursue his dream of financial stability, they had insisted on most of our spare cash going towards the purchasing of suitable breeding stock. However, there was a slight issue. A single income meant that buying frozen rodents for snakes' food wasn't economically viable. As a solution, they had insisted on raising live rats as well. Unlike their scaly executioners, the rats multiplied extremely quickly, and we were frequently inundated with a large supply of the vermin, their huddled masses swelling to fill the cramped cages. No matter how many culls Seth carried out, they were always too many. I was responsible for feeding them and cleaning their cage, something I wasn't particularly fond of, but had agreed to do so in order to keep Seth happy. One evening while I was feeding them, one of them bit me. I pulled my hand back reflexively, but this had accidentally knocked their cage onto the ground, and in an instant, dozens of the things were scrambling to escape. I wasn't able to get any sleep that night, with Seth demanding that I take care of the problem I had caused while they went to bed, locking the bedroom door behind them. To make matters worse, we had a cat at the time, and I wasn't able to successfully lock him up in the bathroom before he'd managed to catch and disembowel a handful of the smaller escaped rodents, leaving their entrails strewn about the living room of our apartment. Anyway, perhaps understandably, my encounter with the rats in the pantry left me in something of a nervous wreck for the remainder of the day. I periodically checked all around the house over and over to make sure not a single remaining one of the vermin was left, jumping at every single perceived movement. Everything felt filthy, contaminated, as though the rats had rubbed their greasy bodies against every surface in the house. Whenever I thought about the horde of squealing things emerging out of the sack, I'd wind up needing to wash my hands to feel clean again. I couldn't recall a time in recent memory that my obsessive compulsive disorder had been triggered this badly. I wound up taking a shower just to try and relieve as much of the contamination anxiety as possible. As soon as I stepped out foot into the hot, flowing water, I could feel my shoulders untense, and I let out a deep breath that I didn't realize I had been holding in. The calming steam combined with the purifying, sterile odor of soap helped to steady my nerves considerably. It was as I was rinsing off that the lights suddenly went out. I was understandably startled, but not too shocked. I'd known that the house had some faulty wiring. Blackouts like these typically only lasted a few seconds. However, whatever electrical issues were affecting the lights had clearly interfered with the water heater as well, as I found myself flailing to get out of range of the suddenly ice cold water. As I backed up to try and get away, however, I felt something sharp rake against my back. It was difficult to hear over the rushing water and the beating of my own heart, but I could have sworn I heard rattling breathing right behind my ear. I'm not ashamed to admit that I screamed out of a mixture of pain and terror, tripping on the slick surface of the shower floor and banging my shoulder quite painfully. A second afterwards, the lights turned back on. I looked about frantically, trying to catch sight of the intruder, but I was alone in the bathroom. My body ached, and adrenaline pumped through my veins like rocket fuel. As I took deep breaths to calm myself down, I watched the water spiral down the drain of the shower, tinged slightly pink. I touched a hand to my back, and it came back stained red with blood. I did eventually manage to calm down enough to prepare dinner at least, though with considerable difficulty. I felt exhausted and tired, the mental strain leading me to decide to head to bed early. I tried to chalk up my injury in the shower to stress, lying to myself as the 4 slash marks I'd found on my back must have simply been inflicted during my fall. I tried not to think about how there were no possible sharp objects in the shower that could have caused this. It wasn't very convincing, but it was the only rational explanation, and contemplating any other potential source made my head spin. I knew that even with my exhaustion, I wouldn't be able to effectively get to sleep without outside assistance, and decided to take a combination of diphenhydramine and melatonin supplements to help ease me into unconsciousness. I took the pills with dinner so that by the time I had finished, I would have no choice but to go to sleep. After lazily dumping my dirty dishes into the sink, I stumbled into my bedroom, shutting and locking the door with a reassuring click. I clumsily changed into my pajamas and slipped into bed before turning off the bedside lamp. The cocktail of sleep aids didn't leave me with much capacity to focus on anything stressful, and fairly soon I was in that pleasant state of half awake near sleep that precedes dreaming, only dimly aware of where I was. Even still, the dosage I had taken wasn't anywhere near enough to induce hallucinations, nor was I yet unconscious. In the foggy, rapidly dissipating remnants of my consciousness, I became dimly aware of a noise coming from close by. I turned my head slightly, half-lidded eyes receiving the dull image of my bedroom, faintly illuminated by the moonlight. My bedroom door was open, an image that I was sure I must have meant an image that I was sure must have meant something in waking, but which my fatigued mind was incapable of understanding the significance of. As my eyelids slowly drifted shut and I fell into a blissful sleep, I could faintly discern something large and pale crawling past the doorway on all fours. I woke up the next morning with a bit of a headache, groaning at the harsh sunlight coming through my window. I blinked the sand out of my eyes. It took me until my vision was clear for me to notice that my bedroom door, which I always made sure to close and lock before I went to sleep, was standing wide open. Like rusted gears starting to grind together, my waking mind slowly began to remember the strange crawling thing in the hallway I had glimpsed just before falling asleep. I've always been a bit paranoid, and this paranoia had only increased after I started living alone. Reaching into my pillowcase, I carefully extracted a pocket knife that I keep hidden there just in case. I hesitated before getting out of bed. I sat there, listening for a few minutes, trying to hear if there was any sound in my house. I couldn't tell for certain. There was no way of knowing, but it felt like I could hear a faint wheezing underneath my bed, as if someone was struggling faintly for breath, or trying to stifle laughter. I'd always had a fear of stepping out of my bed. I didn't like the gap between the floor and the bed frame. It always felt like there was just enough room for someone to hide down there. When I was much younger, sometimes I'd remain confined in bed for hours if I was home alone, afraid that if I'd step my foot on the ground, I'd feel a clammy hand wrap gnarled fingers around my ankle. Slowly, very slowly, I looked down over the edge of my bed, knife clutched tight in my sweaty fingers. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow shift, slightly, as though something ever so subtly had skirted out of view. I swallowed, fear making my heart race in my chest. I counted from 10, but didn't dare close my eyes. When I reached 1, I leapt out of bed, immediately crouching down and lifting the bedspread, knife raised, ready to strike at whatever was hiding there. Nothing. There wasn't even enough room beneath my bed for anyone to fit. Boxes of old childhood toys and knickknacks had filled up all the remaining space down there. Setting the knife down on my bedside table, I rubbed my temples, taking deep breaths to try and calm down. There's nobody else in the house, Trinity, I thought to myself. You're just being paranoid. I felt my stomach growl and remembered how little I had eaten the previous day. Realizing I'd have to actually go out and buy food before I could feed myself, I sighed and put on some clothes, slipping my car keys and wallet into my jacket pocket. "Find everything you were looking for today?" said the cashier, catching herself mid-word as she looked closer at me, eyes drifting towards my neck and shoulders. "Just fine, thank you," I replied, not having any energy to acknowledge this sort of thing. The cashier just nodded and started scanning my groceries, mercifully choosing to eschew the usual small talk one expects from such interactions, though I couldn't help but recall how chatty she had been with the elderly man immediately before me in line. As I sat there patiently waiting for her to finish with my items, I yawned a little, peering around at my surroundings. I used to work in a grocery store like this one, years ago. It was one of my very first jobs. It was always remarkable to me how similar chain stores looked on the inside, like they were procedurally generated levels in some video game, the same assets being assembled pseudo-randomly to create familiar spaces. My train of thought was interrupted when my idle gaze fell upon the monitor above the cashier's head, where the total was supposed to be, or advertisement, or even just a blank screen. There was something murky, shadowed, slowly coming into focus. It seemed to be brightening, just a little at a time, a still image congealing out of the void of black pixels, long, stringy black hair, obscuring a face twisted into something almost resembling All right, that'll be 67.95. I jumped slightly at the cashier's voice, hoping that she didn't notice. "Oh, of course, sorry," I murmured, fumbling for my wallet and grabbing my credit card. The cashier just sighed almost imperceptibly. While I clumsily inserted the card into the chip reader, I looked up at the monitor, simply seeing my purchases total and a list of the items that had been scanned. After being handed my receipt, I thanked the cashier, grabbed my bags, and headed out the automatic door. I chanced to glance backwards on my way out, just to see if I could catch a glimpse of the image on the monitor again, but it was still normal, just an ordinary checkout screen. I shook my head and made my way back to the car. Maybe it wasn't the wisest idea to take a walk that night, given the odd events that had happened previously in the day, but in my defense, at this point I was still operating under the assumption that whatever was going on was merely a consequence of stress and paranoia. I didn't want to believe that I was in any real danger. I've been taking night walks ever since the divorce, mainly to try and work through my fear of the dark. I felt embarrassed being in my mid-20s and still needing to sometimes keep the light on when I went to bed. Frankly, I probably would have started taking the walks sooner, but Seth never felt comfortable with me going outside alone after nightfall. To my credit, the walks did genuinely work to quell some of my nyctophobia. I still didn't feel exactly comfortable in the dark, but it wasn't nerve-wracking anymore. One of my favorite spots for nocturnal wanderings was somewhere that I had perhaps melodramatically christened as the Midnight River. It was a bit of a water district infrastructure, an artificial creek of sorts that passed between the vast blocks of identical suburban homes with gravel maintenance paths on both sides. I wasn't supposed to be there, to be clear. There was a fence with a sign warning me that trespassers would be prosecuted, but frankly, I didn't care. In my mind, the purpose of this sort of sign was to prevent people from going there to toss their trash, spray graffiti, and otherwise pollute or clog the waterway. All I was doing was taking a little walk. It may have been against the letter of the law, but in terms of crimes, it was a fairly victimless one. Hopping over the fence was easy enough. It wasn't exactly tall, and there were plenty of foot and handholds. After I was over the barrier, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone, tapping the flashlight button. Even though I'd worked through a lot of my fear of the darkness, the Midnight River could still be somewhat unsettling at times. You see, if you're walking around after dark in the city or the suburbs, there is still going to be quite a bit of ambient light due to street lamps, advertising billboards, 24-hour convenience stores, etc. The Midnight River, however, was nearly entirely pitch black. It was squeezed between lines of suburban homes, with the tall wooden fences of backyards forming walls that enclosed the entire space. The only places for light to get through were the chain link fences at each end of the Midnight River, which everything in between being smothered in a blanket of perfect, inky blackness. It can actually be quite pleasant once you get used to only being able to see a few feet in front of you. The air was filled with the sound of croaking frogs to my immediate right, along with the gentle babbling of flowing water. This mixed with the crunching of gravel underfoot into a soothing melange of ambient noise. The walk along the Midnight River isn't especially long, maybe 15 minutes at most. I think it must have been about 5 minutes into my short journey that I heard the echo. It was subtle, difficult to notice, but once I had realized it was there, I was unable to ignore it. About a quarter second after each of my footsteps, I could hear another footstep from somewhere behind me. I didn't dare pause to turn around, though I desperately wanted to. I worried that if I stopped moving, whatever was hiding in my footsteps would realize I'd caught onto its presence and attack me. My mind was racing, trying to think of what the source of the sound could be. Mountain lions sometimes come down from the hills and wander into the suburbs, I thought to myself in a panic. Or maybe it's some maniac looking for an easy victim. My neck itched with the desire to turn and look at my pursuer, my free hand reaching down automatically to grip the handle of my pocket knife. This continued for quite some time, the footsteps slowly but surely seeming to get ever so slightly closer. It was clear that even though my pursuer was matching my pace, they must have had a slightly longer stride, allowing them to gradually gain on me. I had to think of something, but every possible method of self-defense seemed somehow insufficient, like bows and arrows against the lightning. I felt weak, small, and vulnerable, without any ability to gain information about whoever or whatever was following me. My mind jumped to the worst possible conclusions to fill the gaps in perception. Eventually, I could see the light at the end of the river, shining from a street lamp through the gaps of the chain link fence. I realized that I was going to have to climb the fence in order to get out. It must have been about 50 yards away when I decided to start running. Not wanting to give my pursuer any warning, I just stuffed my phone in my pocket and began sprinting as fast as I could possibly manage. My muscles burned with strain, and my lungs felt as though they were being pierced with needles, but fear motivated me to run faster than any medal or trophy ever could. As I ran, I could hear the crunch of gravel underfoot behind me, no longer trying to match my footsteps, simply moving as fast as possible to reach me. I almost collided headfirst with the fence, but somehow managed to get a foothold and start climbing, as though genetic memories of ascending trees in the jungle to escape some predatory beast had been unearthed in order to assure my survival. Within seconds, I was out of the midnight river and standing on the sidewalk beneath the blazing light of the street lamp. I fumbled for my pocket knife and opened it, getting into something vaguely resembling a defensive position as I turned to face the one possible place from which my hunter could try and reach me. And there was, indeed, something there in the dark, a dark figure just barely discernible at the edge of the street lamp's light. It took a slightly hesitant step forward, coming so close to being fully visible, but stopped before the light could touch it. I looked up at where I thought its face must be, and I could feel it looking back at me, studying me. Then it simply turned around and began to slowly walk away, back into the blackness, gravel crunching beneath its feet. I could hear it whistling softly as it faded into the shadows. I didn't sleep after my encounter at the Midnight River. I mean, how could I? You're not able to just go home and relax after experiencing something like that. When I arrived back home, I double checked that every door and window in the house was firmly sealed and locked up tight, turned on every light, and proceeded to sit on my bed, clutching the largest kitchen knife I could find, just in case. It must have been around 3 or 4 in the morning when I heard the sound of static coming from the living room. I tiptoed carefully through the rooms of my new home, knife held close in case any intruder suddenly made their presence known. As I reached the living room, I found the TV set on to a dead channel, breaking the silence with a muted roar of signal noise. It was an ancient CRT, older than I was, and despite my shock, I had to admit that there was something faintly nostalgic about the buzzing of the static. As I stood there, unsure of what I was supposed to do, I heard the static quiet down into a low hum of analog noise. I discerned a faint image appearing on the screen. It was dark, shadows on top of shadows, just a vague shape. It didn't take very long for me to realize what I was seeing. The image slowly became brighter and brighter, revealing a blurry, uncanny face, cocked at an extreme angle and partially covered with long, dark hair. The image continued to brighten, starting to come into focus, and I could see more details. The neck seemed broken, unnaturally snapped to an impossible angle. There were tiny pinpricks of light buried deep within the eye sockets, and I can't honestly say I'm convinced any longer that the expression on the face could accurately be described as a smile. I didn't have long to look over the image before there was another burst of static, followed by video footage of the interior of a house, taken from outside a backyard window. The shot panned slowly to the right until I could see myself, staring transfixed with terror at the television set. But the camera wasn't focusing on me. It began to zoom in slowly, focusing down at the couch behind me, revealing a pale, twisted arm, snaking out towards me from underneath the couch. All at once, the lights went out, and the television set shut off as abruptly as it had turned on, leaving me alone in the darkness of the living room, scrambling frantically to get away from the couch, and knocking over a vase of flowers in the process, shattering it on the floor. The lights came back on, and I was alone in the living room. There was nothing reaching out from under the couch. Through the window, however, I could faintly see something climbing rapidly over the fence, disappearing into the neighbor's yard. I nearly had a heart attack when my phone started ringing. I'd spent the remainder of the night hiding in my bedroom with a flashlight, just in case the power went out again, and my nerves were shot from so much time spent awake and afraid. Hours of silence being suddenly interrupted filled me with an intense panic, to the extent that I'm fairly certain in my startled state I screamed something like, "Go away," before realizing it was just my phone. After taking a minute to calm myself, I answered the call. In response, a familiar voice, tinged faintly with an affected transatlantic accent, drifted out of my phone's speakers, replying, "Goodness, Trinity, are you all right? You sound as though you've seen a ghost." It was the voice of my friend Helen, a friend who I sincerely hope is reading this. I just started crying in response. After I'd eventually managed to calm down just a little bit, I explained that all I explained all that had happened, starting with the call from Seth and ending with my pursuer at the Midnight River. The other end of the line remained politely quiet as I explained, with my caller only occasionally interjecting to provide sympathy and prompt me to continue. It felt so incredibly nice to just be able to tell someone what was going on, for someone to listen and take me seriously. After I'd finished my explanation and the tears had stopped flowing, the voice at the other end took some time to reassure me that I wasn't going crazy, that everything was all right. There were some discussions of possible rational explanations, and after a few minutes, I began to feel much more normal. I felt safe again. I hate that it made me feel safe. After a while, the conversation had shifted to mundane topics. I don't even remember exactly what. Something like movies or books we had recently seen or read, things of that nature. I'd moved out of my bedroom and was just lounging on the couch in the living room. There was a brief lull in the conversation, and I was about to say that I needed to go and make myself breakfast, when suddenly the voice at the other end said, "You know, Trinity, I really like the way your clothes smell." I burst out laughing. I couldn't help it. I mean, what else are you supposed to say when a longtime friend just out of nowhere announces that they enjoy the smell of your clothes? The voice at the other end laughed too, before adding, "I thought it must have been some perfume or deodorant you wore, but no. I think it's the clothes, not any sort of scent you add. Perhaps there is something in the detergent that appeals to me because I'm smelling them right now, and they're just as good in your closet as they are on your body." My blood ran cold. If this is your idea of a fucking joke, Helen, it's not funny. Why would you think saying this sort of shit is even remotely okay after what I've been dealing with? There was a laugh on the other end of the line. A sick, acidic laugh, like venom dripping from a serpent's fang. It didn't sound like Helen's laugh at all. "Check the caller ID, Thomas," said the voice, enunciating my dead name in a tone that made my heart drop. With shaking hands, I did as I was told. Unknown caller. The phone number displayed beneath it wasn't Helen's at all. A laugh erupted loudly out of my phone's speakers, louder than it should have been possible. I tried to hang up, but the laughter kept coming. At first I thought that it was something wrong with my phone, and I just pressed down on the power button until the screen went black, but I could still hear it. I realized it wasn't coming out of my phone anymore, though. It was coming from my bedroom. Picking back up the kitchen knife I had left on the counter, I crept to my room, slowly, shakily. As soon as I touched the doorknob, the laughter stopped abruptly. I opened the bedroom door and was greeted still with total silence. Tinnitus rang loud in my ears as I braced myself to open the closet. When I did so, however, there was nobody there. There was nothing there but clothes, shoes, and a cheap old flip phone snapped in two and lying on the wooden floor. I no longer felt safe in my own home by this point. I still wasn't sure if I was being stalked, having some sort of psychotic break, or a combination of the two, but it was becoming abundantly clear to me that I could not stay in the house. I booked a motel room online, the cheapest place I could find at short notice. I wasn't planning on staying long, so I only prepared one suitcase in which I packed my laptop, a change of clothes, and my medication, including a generous quantity of sleep aids. For the record, I did try calling 911, multiple times even, but my calls never seemed to direct to the right number. I'd just be greeted with dead air on the other end, without so much as an automated recording telling me that I had the wrong number. I even tried to call the local police station directly, but had no luck. I considered just driving down to the police station myself, but I realized that the only thing they'd be able to do would be to have an officer take my statement and maybe send someone home to watch my house. I didn't think either of those things would be able to help me anymore. Whatever was happening to me, it was becoming increasingly evident that I was going to need to deal with it alone. I arrived at the motel at about noon, at least. I think that's when I got there. I remember the sun was high in the sky. The receptionist showed me to my room and begrudgingly accommodated me when I insisted that he stay with me for a few minutes while I proceeded to check every nook and cranny for any sign of an intruder. He must have thought I was crazy, but the $20 bill I tipped kept his mouth shut. I tried to do some research into lookatme.png, at least as best as I could with the crappy motel Wi Fi. I had no doubt at this point that the mysterious image was the root cause of all of my suffering, and at the same time, I felt my increasing certainty that Seth had absolutely nothing to do with it, at least not directly. I still blamed them for all of this, though. I wouldn't have clicked that email if it wasn't for them. In any event, my search turned up no actual usable leads. The idea of a cursed image seemed at least as old as the internet itself, and even looking for specific instances of the phrase, look at me, in conjunction with such topics didn't really give me anything to work with. In the end, funnily enough, the most useful piece of information I found was a typo riddled post on some tech forum from a decade ago describing a computer crash caused after downloading a weird image from an email by accident. The original poster was convinced that the image had been a computer virus, and the thread was locked by a moderator after they started cursing out a user who said that they were an idiot for downloading random email attachments. This didn't bring me any closer to solving my problem, but I at least knew now that I wasn't lookatme.png's only victim. It seemed to be getting darker more rapidly all the time. When you are exposed to continual stress, it changes your perception of time. The periods of time during the stressful events themselves feel like they last forever, the clock's hands moving past at a snail's pace. Then, when you're alone, when you're no longer in immediate danger, time starts to flow faster again, all while your mind relives over and over the terrors you experienced. It felt like only minutes after I checked into my room and began doing my research that the sun was beginning to set. I ate a supper of instant ramen I had bought from the gas station across the street, cooking it with hot water from the motel room coffee maker. My energy finally started to fail me, and I decided that the very least I should do was brush my teeth before going to bed, though I was not planning on turning off any lights. It was the motel's electricity bill, not mine, and I refused to be alone in the dark after all I had experienced. I shuffled over to the bathroom, feeling more like a zombie than a living human being. My reflection seemed to support that descriptor. Greasy, unwashed hair, dark eye bags, and sunken cheeks showed the toll that this was taking on me, physically and mentally. As I moved to brush a tangled lock of hair out of the way of my eyes, some of it actually came up in a clump. My lip trembled, but I didn't have the energy to cry, and I found my mouth shifting into a now familiar grimace. I wanted to smash the mirror, but I didn't have the energy. Instead, I just slunk off to bed, hoping that tomorrow all of this would be just a bad dream, but knowing in my heart that it would only get worse. I should have known better than to expect uninterrupted sleep. I was awakened at some point in the early morning before the sun came up by a tapping against my window. I opened my eyes to find that the lights I had made sure to leave on the night before were all now off. Flipping the switch on the bedside lamp did nothing. The tapping came once again, and I turned to look. The blinds began to roll up by themselves, slowly, revealing a view of the parking lot illuminated by the bright moon. Creeping down from the top of the windows, I caught sight of a pair of feet dangling into view, then legs, arms, a torso, all descending like a puppet on strings, and clothed in ripped, blood-stained nightclothes. Finally, the face came into view, and I shuddered with recognition. It was me. The neck was bent at an impossible angle. Long greasy hair cascaded over sunken eyes, and lips curled into a painted, almost, smile. But it was me. I realized with horror what lookatme.png had been depicting when I noticed the noose around the corpse's neck. One of the arms began to move, pressing a lifeless finger against the glass of the motel window and scrawling a series of letters in dark, dead blood. Firstkiss. First kiss. When the corpse was finished, the arm dangled lifelessly against its sides once more, and it turned around to face the moon. It seemed to float out into the parking lot, the hanging rope carrying it along as it slowly gained altitude, ascending further and further upwards into the dark sky. The blinds began to move again on their own accord, covering up the window like curtains at the end of a play. Despite everything I had been through, despite the horrifying dullness I felt in my heart from days of constant lack of safety, I still had enough energy left to cry. The thing's instructions were simple enough to follow. I knew where I had received my first kiss. I arrived at the zoo as soon as it opened, hoodie up over my head in an attempt to obscure as much of my sleep-deprived, dead-eyed face as possible. I didn't bother stopping to look at any of the exhibits, instead making a beeline for the reptile house. I haven't visited it in a long time. It brought back bad memories of a relationship that had already begun to curdle at the time of that long-ago visit. My prompt arrival at the zoo's opening, combined with the fact that it was a weekday, meant that for the time being I was the only visitor in the building. I walked past the chuckwallas, the tortoises, the Gia monsters, the rattlesnakes, the horned toads, a veritable parade of cold-blooded beasts, ignoring them all until I arrived at my destination, the anaconda. It just sat there, as it always did, an albino serpent the length of a truck, just lazing around in the moist, green habitat that was its whole world. I doubt it even registered my presence in the room. I sat down on a bench and waited to see what would happen next. It didn't take very long. After a few minutes, someone walked into the room. I didn't even need to look up to know who it was, or rather who it was pretending to be. Even in my peripheral vision, I could recognize myself. "Hello, Thomas," it said, its voice a perfect mimicry of my own. "That's not my name." It cackled, mockery dripping from its voice as its laughter reverberated through the dark room. I just sat there and waited for it to finish. I was too tired to be afraid anymore. Part of me hoped that it had brought me there to kill me. "What do you want?" I asked. "Look at me." "I already have." "Look at me." I did as I was told, raising my eyes to look at the thing that had systematically worked to destroy my will to live. Its face was pale, its eyes dull, with lips a dull blue. The ends of its twisted knot smile twitched slightly as I made eye contact. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. It didn't respond. It just kept looking at me with its dead, glassy eyes. "What do you want from me?" The thing reached a stiff, dead hand into its pocket, producing a scuffed and ancient flash drive. "Pass it on. Make someone else look at me," it said, tossing the flash drive to the ground with a clatter of plastic on concrete. "No." In a flash, it was on top of me, hands tight around my throat. I struggled to breathe and frantically tried to push off my doppelganger's stiff, cold body, but to no avail. "It is very different," it said, "to think you want to die and to actually want to die. If you really wanted me to kill you, you wouldn't be here right now. You would have done it to yourself already, you disgusting coward. You wouldn't try to fight back as you feel your own hands close around your neck. You wouldn't even try to take another breath. But you don't really want to die. You just want to stop suffering. That's not the same thing. And until you do choose to die, I can make you suffer. Much, much worse than this." It let go abruptly, and I fell to the ground in a heap, shaking and coughing. The shot of adrenaline from my body's latent desire to stay alive provided me with just enough emotional energy to feel very, very afraid. The thing picked up the flash drive off the ground and placed it firmly in the palm of my hand. I winced at its touch. "Make someone else look at me," it said, and walked away, melting into the shadows of the dimly lit room. And that brings us to the here and now. I'm sitting at my computer now, staring at this Word document and trying very hard not to pay attention to the reflection I can see in my monitor, at the figure standing right behind me. I've been writing this all out in one sitting, so I apologize if it isn't particularly coherent, Helen, but I know you'll understand. I trust you will have done as I instructed, and hopefully by the time you're actually reading this, it has been several days after I wrote it. Right now, in another window, I have an email draft open. I'm using a temporary account, one of those self-destructing addresses that will delete in about an hour. I imagine I don't have to tell you what the email's title is, nor the name of its sole attachment. I haven't set a recipient yet. When I first started writing this all out, I thought for sure I'd just send it to Seth, set the title to something like, "Here is a check for how much I owe you," or something like that. But no matter how much they hurt me, I can't bring myself to do this to them, even if it is their fault that it is happening to me. I think I'll just try and find someone on LinkedIn or something and send it to them instead. It feels less horrible if the victim isn't somebody I know. If it's personal, it feels like murder. You've probably been wondering why I divided this all into stages, why I told you only to look at one each day. It's actually very simple. I didn't want you to call the police. It is very possible that by the time you're reading this, I am already dead. I don't want to see how much this thing can make me suffer. I'm hoping that after I pass on the email, it will just leave me alone, but I can't trust that in this case. I don't want to be put on suicide watch and kept from getting out all of this if there is no other way. At the same time, I want other people to know. I don't want anyone else to have to suffer through this like I have. I want the next idiot to download lookatme.png to have a fighting chance, an idea of what they're up against. This is the only way I can make that happen. I'm going to send these documents to you, Helen, so that you can spread them far and wide. Then I'm sending the email. What happens after that, I don't know. Thank you. So, at its heart, this story is about transgenderism, I believe. Trinity is a trans woman who has recently gone through a breakup with her partner, Seth. Now, the legitimate cause for the breakup with Seth is sort of questionable, and the only reason that I say that is because we only get Trinity's side of the story, of course, because the story is told through from her. But I think we can assume, based on what she said, that a lot of it has to do with Seth. I'm hesitant, however, to pin the breakup solely on Seth because the way that Trinity talks, it's very evident that this is an individual who is struggling with insecurity. And now, of course, everyone sort of matures at their own different rate and in their own different ways. But I think a lot of the times someone who is not secure in themselves, a lot of the times is not ready for a relationship. A lot of people say that you can't truly or fully love someone until you've learned to love yourself. And unfortunately for Trinity, I don't think, based on the way that she talks, that she's there yet. And Trinity finds this out the hard way when she gets married young and ends up going through a divorce pretty early on in her life. And she even explains that as a trans woman, she is still learning to accept herself. And this whole concept of acceptance is really Trinity's arc throughout the entirety of the story, learning to, accept herself for the woman that she is. And I believe that this battle manifests itself in the form of the creature associated with lookatme.png. Think of the way that it constantly refers to Trinity as her dead name, which is Thomas. I look at it as sort of almost like this inner voice in her head that is constantly arguing with her and trying to keep her from doing what makes her happy. So as we know, the struggle with oneself is not exclusive to one type of person. Hence the reason why I think the creature has to be passed along from person to person. Going along with this theory, that would mean that once the person who has this creature has overcome the fear of it or of themselves, they can then move on from it. Fortunately for Trinity, it seems like she is able to do that, but at the cost of having, to pass it on. She knows how difficult it is to grapple with, insecurity and self-doubt, and it seems at the end of the story, would rather potentially die than have to to pass it on. I should have mentioned this earlier. There are a few sort of, I guess, interludes between each of the original 4 posts that were written by Helen, or Priestess of Spiders. I chose not to include them in the story itself or in the narration because I was afraid that it would sort of interrupt with the flow of the story. But if you're into this story, I would strongly suggest going down to the link below and checking those out. It just might aid in sort of, context, and you get a little bit more of Helen's perspective on Trinity and their relationship and everything like that. But as always, guys, thank you so much for taking the time to check out this video, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week.